Operation Food for Life really started accidentally, you might like to say. Dennis Perry, who at the time was export manager of Sanitarium, was on one of his business trips in Tonga. And as he was driving back to the airport, he was confronted with a scene that he'd never really seen before. There was all these people living on the rubbish dump and looking for food on the rubbish dump. And he said to himself, why is that the case? Why isn't someone helping them? Then he said, well, there's no reason perhaps why I can't help them. So he did. He went back into town, got some food, and came back and fed them. And that started Operation Food for Life. So for the final years of my life at Sanitarium, health and wellbeing, and Dennis's as well, because we retired very close to each other, we continued doing Operation Food for Life, and in that time we took it to the Cook Islands and Kiribati and Tonga, New Guinea, just to name a few. We knew from our experience that we would only pick one area to do it, and that was Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. We could see the need was huge there in many areas, and so we decided that's where we would start, and that's kept us very busy ever since. I was driving a truck of stock ready to go to one of the schools that we were going to feed the students with, and I noticed against the skyline on the hill there's a whole lot of people. And I had two national boys with me in the truck at the time, and I said to the boys, what are all those people doing up there? And they looked at their watch and they said, oh, it's 2 minutes to 10 o'clock. And the first rubbish truck for the day comes in at 10 o'clock. And they're all waiting so they get first pick of the truck when it first arrives. To visualise how those people live it is very hard, but if you can picture 4 old 44-gallon drums with a bit of rotten cardboard or a bit of plastic on the top, that was home. That was home, and that was right in amongst the rubbish and all the smoke of the burning rubbish. Operation Food for Life has been, as I said, the stones in the water and the ripples are going. Even we don't know what those ripples might be yet. This is a great way to spend your retirement. You get a lot of satisfaction of it. And what I get out of it is the pure joy and satisfaction of seeing a smile on a face when you've made something different to their lives, when you've been able to help them just in a small way. That is worth all of the work behind the scenes.
This is just another great story, and there's so much more. Operation Food for Life has set up preschools and is also helping people with disabilities in Papua New Guinea.
These two men with a vision are making a huge difference to so many. They saw the needs and found ways to fix them.
Again, what they're doing shows that volunteering with purpose can make that kind of difference.
It helps to ask the question, what will your retirement look like?
In this episode, we take a look at successfully making the transition from the working life to the retired life. It can be difficult for some.
To move from work to retirement involves acknowledging that there's going to be a sense of loss. There's going to be that loss of your connections, your friendship connections within your workplace, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning. So it is probably one of the biggest changes we make in life. And so a sense of loss of the reason to get up in the morning is one of the big transitions we're going to make. There's also a sense of moving from a structured environment into something that we have to structure ourselves. And that can be an interesting transition too, because now we have to take charge of our own day, our own program, and we need to fill that with something. We need a reason to get up in the morning.
I think the transition in those issues from work to retirement is massive, and I think often underestimated by people. People just go, oh great, I don't have to go to work. How good will that be? I'll sleep in, I can do whatever I like. And my experience has been in talking to people that it's actually quite a jolt. And it's quite a transition for them and can often involve a real grief process. They may have been in a profession for 40 or 45 years. They're known as a school teacher, for example, and now they're not a school teacher anymore. Because how are you a school teacher if you're not teaching? You're a retired school teacher, which somehow puts you in a different category. So for us as men particularly, so much of our identity is wrapped up in our work. So when we're not working anymore, working for pay, then who are we? So unless we've thought about that and seen that our identity is greater than what we do, it's about what we are, not just what we do, we can really run into trouble. Working for pay is significant because it's very measurable. I am achieving something because this is the money that I bring in, and it pays the power bills and it pays the food. And for us as men, we like to be able to measure what we do and measure our contribution. The work that we might do as volunteers or the work around the house after we're retired, it's a little harder to measure. And it's harder to actually go, I've done something worthwhile. I've done something that I can be proud of. Society, I think, conditions us to say, if it's worthwhile, then you'll get paid for it. If you haven't been paid for it, maybe it wasn't all that important.
Any way you look at life, it's about beginnings and endings, endings and beginnings. There are transitions throughout life, and Nancy Schlossberg, a psychologist, in her book Too Young to Be Old, talks about the transitions of life. And she suggests that people coming toward retirement, they've already been through so many transitions that they understand about them. So you shouldn't worry too much about them. She talks about the transitions going from schooling, university, to work. And then there's, of course, marriage, then there's children, and then there's different workplaces, so on. They're all transitions. So her counsel is, look, you've gone through transitions before, so you have somewhat of expertise in that role. So just apply the same things that you applied back in the other transitions, and that'll help you through the transition to retirement.
It's really interesting that women define their identity a little bit differently than men do. Women define their identity in terms of relationships and in terms of their connectedness, while we as men define our identity in terms of what we do.
There are many things that come from work that we don't appreciate until we've lost it. We get status, we get purpose, we get time management, income, and social connections. When we're not working, we've got to be able to substitute all those things. And it's only when we're not working we realise that that's what work did provide. As much as we might have complained about the boss and our colleagues and how much work we had, we're actually getting significant benefits from it.
It's worth recognising what is lost in retirement. Work can give us status, purpose, time management, income and social connections.
And because they're important, how do we replace them in retirement? That will impact on how well we transition into retirement.
And then there's a problem that legislation around retirement is constantly changing, and that can cause confusion.
I think it's changed over the years. When I first started writing about retirement, there are a number of people who, I suppose, did retire, or they had certain, they were able to retire, you know, in a reasonable way because their superannuation or their finances were sort of, I guess, sorted out. Over the last few years, I've seen more and more people saying, I wouldn't mind just doing a couple of days at work a week, or I wouldn't mind, you know, having an on-call career, you know, going back and doing something totally different. So the transition has changed over the years. So stopping work for some people is not an option. They still want to be doing something as well, but you know, it's the actual thinking about how you're actually going to stop or how you're actually going to do something else. It's a great transition.
One of the complications we have about retirement in the developed world is that we're living longer. You're likely to live much longer than your parents. And you're certainly likely to live much longer than your great-grandparents or your great-great-grandparents. This also means that we are retired longer. And so we've got to ask the question, what will we do with this time? We have options, and they can be work options. We could work part-time, for instance, instead of full-time. We can kind of transition slowly, instead of jumping off the cliff, just sliding off the cliff into retirement. What working part-time can do is help with the transition, because you're actually doing that glide thing into the transition rather than jumping off the cliff, and it can help you adjust. So it's worth thinking about as you come to retirement.
You know, I think that people sort of fear the process of retirement unnecessarily, because all it is it's just another transition, and people have been through lots of transitions during their lifetime and they've coped adequately. So when you start a new job, when you go to university for the first time, when you finish university, when you get married, when you have children, these are all important transitions. And in a way, retirement's no different than that. But understanding how you best cope with those transitions and trying to have some insight to how you've managed those previously will help. The other thing that helps a lot is having mastery.
Actually, it's interesting when you do look back and see how you coped or how you embraced the challenge.
Yes, it is. And it's much more than various levels of school and work. It's also about job changes, getting married, becoming a family, and so on.
We do tend to cope, don't we? And we get mastery of the situation.
I do encourage people, when they're trying to better cope with retirement and the transition that it brings, to talk about other important transitions they've had in their life, because I think the coping strategies that they've learned, they can repeat in retirement. So, you know, for example, big transitions like maybe moving out of home, getting married, having children, starting their first job, maybe going into a senior appointment, moving interstate, moving overseas, spending a long time overseas, all of those sorts of transitions people have coped with up until that point. And if they haven't, then even that's worth reflecting on. Like, what did they do when they did cope best, as opposed to when they found it more challenging. So I think there's very much an opportunity to reflect and learn on what they already know about themselves.
The other thing that really helps with transitioning is planning and making the planning achievable. I like this formula that's been mentioned before, where you have the half plus the 1 plus the 5 years, or the 6 months and the 12 months and the 5 years. Planning in those kind of slots, those kind of lots, so that it's easier to plan. It's too hard to plan 5 years out or 10 years out and so on. So when you plan, you're not going from something to nothing. You're going from something to something.
Making sure that you've thought about the phasing out of work into the next stage of life. So that means things like developing interests, developing hobbies, maintaining health, not having the personal identity totally tied up in the employer or the business. I'd particularly comment there on us males are probably more prone to that than females. I remember when I did my retirement coaching course, one of the statistics that stuck in my mind was that the suicide rate of men in the US over 72 was greater than of teenage males. And a lot of it was a result of they'd lost their purpose, they'd lost their identity, where in the US work is such an important part of what they do, and all of a sudden it's taken away and they've lost who they are. So being able to sort of plan for that, probably from about the age of 50, to make sure that when work is not such a large percentage of your life, there's something else to substitute for it.
That is, believing that when you set goals, you can actually implement them. Look, I think a lot of people fear retirement unnecessarily. It's only about a third of people will find retirement difficult to adjust to. So 2/3 of people are in good shape, and the other third might have already been struggling prior to retirement anyway. But look, I don't think there's ever any expectation that you've got to go it alone. So finding people that can provide support, like Beyond Blue, for example, have some great programs and great support. If people are struggling emotionally and having difficulty adjusting psychologically, so don't be afraid to ask for help. Go and see your GP. Let them know that it's a much tougher transition than you thought.
These are important points. And I like the fact that most people do transition well into retirement. That's worth knowing.
And for those who don't transition well, help can be found. Friends or your doctor could be a good start. Sometimes all it takes is a listening ear, a sounding board.
If you need more, in Australia, organisations like Beyond Blue are available, and I'm sure there'll be similar organisations in other countries. It's always a sign of strength to get professional help when you need it.
The 1/3 that find it difficult to transition is sometimes related to how much they value different life roles. You know, if you've really heavily invested in work and all the social connections that you have are with work, then when you're in retirement, it might not necessarily be the work role that you miss as much as the social contact that you had. So if people highly value their role as, you know, maybe someone who contributes back to the community or as a family member, then that can just be easily substituted and create a sense of continuity. So how easy or difficult it is depends largely on how similar the roles are that they'll have in their own minds.
What people are doing right now, watching this series, is actually helping them transition into retirement because they're gathering information about it. Every one of us, certainly at our age, every one of us has made transitions in the past. We know how to do it, but sometimes we need the information to be able to do it. Think about transitioning from schooling, whatever schooling, university, whatever, to the workplace. That training, that instruction has helped to do that. And when you get into the workplace, transitioning to another job, you actually have some training to do that. And even marriage, you have training in getting to know the person. So I think it's a good thing to actually sit down and say, what's going to happen here? And develop that kind of thinking, that kind of plan. What am I going to do in the first 6 months, 12 months, 5 years?
Preparing for retirement means reading about it, talking to others about it, watching a program like this, for example, and getting as ready as you possibly can for this next big thing, next big change in your life.
I try and get them to think about the long term. I get them to think about exercises like, you know, what's your 80th or 90th birthday speech going to say? What ultimately are people going to say in your eulogy? And, you know, I have a couple of sayings. You know, your eulogy is yet to be written. Your life up to now will get 2 lines. Most of your eulogy will be what you do between now and whenever that happens. And get them to think about, we're talking a 25 to 30 year potentially time frame. So we've got a long time to plan, we've got a long time to do things. So one of the options I often talk to people about is going back to do a 3-year course at a technical or technical institution or a university. And they say, oh, but take 3 years. And I say, but if you've got 25 or 30 years to get the benefit of it, it's only 3 years, it's not long.
When you're thinking about planning, you want to have set goals in all of those different areas that I spoke about before. So finances, of course, health, have some activities in there that will keep you well physically. Social, having some social goals, thinking about how you're going to continue to improve cognitive functioning. So, reading, book clubs, crosswords, bridge, all of those things are helpful. Emotionally, being aware when you yourself are struggling and knowing where to get some help if you need it. And then lastly, motivation, which is really just about continuing to set goals. And the goals themselves don't need to necessarily be very grandiose, but you need to have a plan to go beyond just the goal itself and implementing it.
We need to put an emphasis on preparing and planning as we talk about transitioning. It's a key to a good retirement.
Having said that, we also need to recognise that each of us is different. That means we need our own individual plans. There's no one size fits all. It can't be, because each bring who we are into retirement.
Then there's the complication of being a couple planning their retirement. That calls for some good discussion.
The best way to prepare for the changes of retirement is not to be in denial about it, to think about it, to talk together about it, to dream about it, to start to make plans, to consult, to actually be purposeful about it, and so that when it happens, it's not a shock. You're not so suddenly going, oh, okay, what do we do now? Because you've already got lots of plans afoot. You've already made some decisions about where you're going to go, where you're going to travel, who you're going to spend time with, who you're going to do things with.
I think the biggest issue is not planning for it, not planning for the non-financial side, and probably not planning for the financial side, not realising what their cost of living is, not appreciating that they need to have a source of funds that needs to extend for, you know, a long time, 25 or 30 years.
Yeah, there's actually been some really good research coming out of the States there, where some people just adapt from day one and keep adapting. Other people will increase in terms of their adaptation, and in other groups decreases. So there's a lot of individual differences. I think people put a lot of pressure on themselves to work towards deadlines. You know, I've been retired for 18 months now and I'm not settled. What's wrong with me? I think it's very different for each person. So I don't think putting pressure like that on yourself is helpful. But I think being insightful about what sort of things you're finding difficult and doing something about it is probably more helpful.
Couples or not, there's a lot to think about as you transition to retirement. Some will find it easy, others not. That's worth remembering.
This is why planning is key to try and take as much stress out of it as possible.
But there are some other things worth knowing. The big thing is that everyone does it differently.
And that's important because you won't live anyone else's retirement. It's yours and yours alone.
Well, supporting each other during retirement, I think, comes back to, you know, my idea that keep the conversation going. You know, just, you know, keep talking to each other, keep sharing, being available and responsive, being connected. You know, I think that that's really important, and you can show that, I think, by the way that you listen to each other, the way that you turn towards each other, the way you empathise with each other, the way you become involved in each other's world. Knowing each other, you have the time and space to know each other incredibly well, and that's the way in which you give emotional support and encouragement to one another.
And through that sense of love and value and respect and appreciation, they negotiate with each other how they're going to fill in that retirement space. And, you know, it doesn't mean to say everything has to be done as a couple. Strong and beautiful intimate relationships allow the man to go and play his golf and the woman to go and to her patchwork quilting class. They don't have to both be there together.
I think there are three things worth doing at the beginning of retirement. The first is to celebrate. Hey, you've made it. Just celebrate the fact that you are transitioning into a new life. This can be exciting, a new life where you're in control. The second is to establish some kind of routine. I mean, you are now in charge of this time of your life, and it's good to have routine, otherwise you may not accomplish anything. Time can go by without anything happening. One of the good things you can do is actually take a piece of paper, draw up a weekly list of what you're planning for every week. Now, of course, you'll change it over time. There'll be things that happen and it won't always be the same. But a routine puts you in charge of your life. You're in control. You're the master when you have routine. The third thing is to be active. Health is important. Health is very important. You know, do the exercise thing, do the 10,000 steps, whatever, but remain active and flexible, physically, mentally, and so on.
People, retirees in their first few months of retirement, they do amazing things. It's often very difficult to actually work out what to do, because when you look at work, it's given them structure, it's given them income, it's given them support, it's given them socialisation as well as being part of perhaps a network or an organisation. So for many people, they've got the big trip planned, and the first 6 months, it's usually the big trip. You know, maybe planning some renovations around the home, and maybe, you know, just getting out there and having some fun and not having to get up at a certain hour, which is not a great idea to sort of sleep in too long.
They usually have a bit of a hit list of things that they want to do when they first retire, and those other examples I gave you are typical. You know, it's a big trip, spending more time with the grandkids, painting something, recarpeting, renovating, all of those things are on the agenda. But then beyond that, you know, sometimes the plan's only sort of 12 to 18 months out. So that's why I keep encouraging people to keep reviewing that plan, because most people spend a lot more time than 18 months in retirement.
Mistakes I've seen people make in retirement, there's been a few, I suppose. Moving too far away from where they used to be, assuming that things are always going to be the same, assuming that their finances are going to be the same, the people around them are going to be the same, assuming that life doesn't change in retirement. And of course it does change incredibly, but also assuming that you don't really have to keep up your skills and your abilities, because that's one way of the plan B. I suppose plan B is one thing that a lot of people don't think about. What if something doesn't happen? What will plan be?
The mistakes that I see people make about retirement is thinking that it is one long holiday. As I said before, when leisure becomes the purpose, it's no longer leisure. Retirement is actually a third phase of life. It's a phase of life where you need to develop new routines. Every day can potentially become Sunday unless you plan for it. You can't eat and drink all the time. You can't play golf all the time. You can't fish all the time.
I think the transition to retirement is an interesting one, because it means different things for different people. And as I was, sort of been saying, that people like to do different things. Some people like to stop and then say, well, I'm going to contribute and volunteer, or I'm going to travel, or I'm going to babysit, or I'm going to do a lot of different things. But I think it's important to find a passion. It's important to find some sort of purpose in your life, and make sure that this concept of lopsided leisure doesn't take over of your life, so that the wake-up call of 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock or whatever it might have been gets later and later. So having purpose and passion is very important when you're looking at the transition.
Purpose and passion. That's a good mix when you look at transitioning into retirement. Anyone who has purpose and passion will not find it as difficult to make the change.
And if you want another P word, plan. I think you have retirement transition just about covered. We hope you found this episode helpful as you look at your retirement. It's tricky to know exactly what's going to happen, but there are ways to work through it.
And we hope you can join us for the next episode when we're looking at ways of having an income in retirement.